Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you for rejoining us this afternoon. I'm Carina Kamel from Arabiya, and I'm so excited to be moderating this panel. It's not my first time moderating female empowerment panels, and it's something that's very close to my heart, and so I'm very pleased that it's been put on this agenda. Women's empowerment is a subject that needs to be discussed, not just by women, but by men. So I'm very pleased to see many men in our audience here today, and we will be expecting some very constructive questions from you later, so please start thinking about them. We also can't talk about women's empowerment without talking about gender equality, and that is an area in the Arab world in particular in which the battle is very much still uphill for most women. However, things have changed in recent years, and there has been some progress, and I hope that we can come away today with some notion of where we are, where we're headed, and what has been achieved. We are very lucky to have a formidable lineup with us of Arab women, and I shall start by briefly introducing our speakers, and then we're going to have a discussion amongst ourselves, and then I really want to make sure that we get a chance to hear from you guys. So please jot down questions as you think of them so that you can pose them later. I'd like to start out by introducing Rana Al Nibari, who is currently the CEO of INJAZ Kuwait. INJAZ Kuwait is part of the global nonprofit, which some of you may know, Junior Achievements Worldwide. It's an organization that strives to create valuable work opportunities for young people in the Arab world, and Rana is herself actually an LBS alum. So thank you for being with us. Najla Al Shirawi is currently CEO of Securities and Investment Company based in Bahrain. SICO is one of the GCC's premier wholesale banks offering investment banking services, and Najla herself comes from an investment banking background. Dr. Florence Eid Oakden is CEO of Arabiya Monitor, an independent research firm that focuses on the Middle East, and Florence is a renowned economist who's worked at JP Morgan and the World Bank, amongst other places. And last but not least is Dr. Mona Hamami, who is currently a director at the Office of Strategic Affairs at the Abu Dhabi Crown Prince Court, where she heads up a think tank that advises on a range of policy issues. So I think that we are going to be able to tick many, many different boxes with this great lineup. I'm going to start by asking you, Rana, if I may. I'm going to kick off with a question here. With regards to your role at INJAZ, it seems to be, for those who may not be familiar with the organization, that you are at a crossroads or perhaps intersection between the public sector, the private sector, and the NGO civil society world, and that you're sort of bringing all of these different stakeholders together in order to create opportunities for young people in general, but I also want to hear about how you're helping women in particular, and how do all these different stakeholders come together and work together to actually help women in your field in Kuwait?
Thanks, Carina. First of all, I'm really happy to be on this panel, and I'm really happy to have Carina because you're quite an enthusiastic person about this topic. So what INJAZ does is that we empower youth by giving them programs, educational programs, in three areas. One of them is entrepreneurship, work readiness, and financial literacy. So by looking at the youth today, there's a huge bulge. We're talking about 50% of the MENA youth are under the age of 25. And looking at countries such as Kuwait, the first topic that was discussed today, Kuwait is on a lifeline called oil. So given that situation, it's extremely pertinent to invest in youth today, and this is what we're doing. And as you rightfully mentioned, we do this through collaborating with the private sector to give us not only funding, but volunteers to teach the youth today.
And so just to be clear, this is a mentorship program and skills training?
It is a mentorship program, a skills training program that goes in line with K to 12 education, as well as university. So what we do is that we facilitate our programs sometimes through the schools and sometimes after schools.
Excellent.
And what you were talking about earlier is what we do for women today. I think by targeting that large demographic of youth, we are touching on women, and we're teaching women entrepreneurship. So the future of tomorrow's youth is for them to be empowered economically so that they can own their economic success.
I'm going to come back and ask you a bit more in detail about that, but I'd like to move on to Najla because I know that you currently work in banking and you have worked in investment banking for many years. Tell us about the situation in Bahrain today for those who may not be familiar with it. I know that the numbers speak of a very positive story. are they reflected in a positive way as well in actuality?
Certainly. Bahrain, I think, has pioneered women empowerment in the region. It started back in 2001 with the National Action Charter in Bahrain, whereby women were given the rights to run for the parliament and to vote. And thereafter, the king has established the Supreme Council for Women as an advisory council to the king on issues that relates to the empowerment of women in different areas of the economy. The Council for Women came up with a national strategy for women empowerment with a number of initiatives. One of them is that to take a year, a full year, to celebrate women in different industries. For example, previous years celebrated women in the medical industry, in education, and this
How
year,
celebrate them in what way?
it is a matter of recognizing the success stories. So showcasing role models, as well as looking at the issues of equal opportunities, equal pay. And this is basically for the public and the private sector as well. This year we are celebrating women working in the financial sector. But other than that, if you look at the statistics of women participation in Bahrain, we actually have now 3 ministers, 3 ambassadors, we have 17 judges, female judges, and Bahrain had the first female judge in the entire region back in 2006. So all of these initiatives, I think, worked in favor of showing that women are capable in our society. However, we still have the same problem that everyone else is having in the Middle East, which is the ratio of women participation in the labor force.
Right.
It's still very low.
Yeah.
For us in Bahrain, it's around 35% in the private sector, 47% in the public sector, which is very sort of good progress. However, if you look at the financial sector, which is one of the main contributors to the government revenue, because we don't have as much oil as anyone else within the Gulf, we still have just 38%.
Wow. Okay, so it's
even though we have, in terms of education, around 53% of university graduates are women.
So there's that disparity. And that's actually a theme that I want to come back to because it's prevalent in many countries. But Florence, first, I want to come to you because you actually started your own company. So you are an entrepreneur. And I wanted to know, what are the challenges? Can you just tell us a little bit about that kind of struggle to start your own company and see it grow and thrive to this point? And what, if there's young women out there, what can you tell them about your story?
Happy to talk about that. It's been a fantastic story. I started Arabiya Monitor 5 years ago here in London after doing exactly what I do now in the city at JP Morgan, where I was chief economist for the Middle East. And my team, many of whom are here in the room, and I do exactly that, economic research on the Arab markets. It's been brilliant and very, very interesting, not without challenges, starting a company at the bottom of the financial crisis in 2009-10. But I want to just make a couple of remarks that relate to what my colleagues on the panel have just alluded to. We have a problem in the Middle East today, which is the following. The education of women has advanced. So when I was professor at the American University of Beirut, half of the students I taught, if not more, in finance and economics. This is not, history and fine arts. Finance and economics, half the students were women. It is the same in the Gulf today. Half, if not more than half, of university graduates are women. When you get to the labor market, we still have a gender gap. And the reason why we have a gender gap, and as you said, Najla, close to 50% of employment in the public sector is female. However, in the private sector, it drops down to 20, 30%. Why is that? It's because there's a cultural shift that is required, and that is a generational shift. And how do we accelerate that? We accelerate it through making available financing for entrepreneurial ventures run by women. Just to conclude on a thought, that I'm happy to come back to any of this later on in the discussion. When I was professor at the American University of Beirut, we started the very first entrepreneurial program in the region. It was the business plan competition at the American University of Beirut. We started it in the year 2000. I had just returned from the States where I did my doctorate, and I was inspired by what I saw at MIT, and I did the same thing with my students in Beirut. This was the very first program in the region, and I was, by the way, on the board of INJAZ when it was first started in Beirut. This was the very first. All of this was new, and when we started this was 15 years ago now, we were told that it would never come off the ground because there was no financing. This was at the time when the NASDAQ was melting. There was no venture capital left in the market, etc. And we were also told that this was going to be a male-dominated club. The result was that there was plenty of financing for this initiative when we started it. And half of the submissions for new business plans for new companies were by female students. And so the appetite is there. However, when these women get to the market, they face a cultural barrier, a major, major wall. Glass ceiling, glass walls, where it's all over the place. They're in a little golden cage, I think. And they don't get there. And the solution is finance. And we can get to that in another
It's
segment.
really interesting that you have that is your view, because I do want to ask about that. But I actually want to bring Mona in now, because that's very relevant to exactly what you're saying. In the UAE, according to the latest UN Human Development Report, the labor participation rate for females is actually 46.5%. And the education level is obviously much higher. It's above 70%. But still, 46.5%, I believe, is higher than many other Arab countries. Do you think, as you work on policy issues and you advise the Crown Prince Corps on policy issues, is the barrier to female labor force participation something that needs to be legislated, or are we talking here about an institutional, cultural, social barrier that is going to be surmounted in a different way and will take generations?
Yeah, and thank you so much, Carina, and thank you for the LBS team for having me here. I think it's all of the above and plus. So some of the barriers are simply economic, and the fact that the economies have not created jobs that allow for women to be there. There's a cultural barrier where the perception is that women only fit in particular jobs. There's a social, the culture of family sort of restrictions that are put on women, your role as a, head of a household and all that. Then there's the legal side, and I would divide the legal into two types. One is the labor laws and social security laws within that, and then you have the other one, which is the constitutional rights. The right to divorce, the right for having your own passport without going to your husband, the right to travel, all of these other things. On the gender. And then there's a role of the infrastructure. So, transportation is one example. I can give childcare, all other examples. And the last one, I think, is more this government policy. And then the government policy comes in, its effect on the regulatory side, but it also comes in two other forms. And I tend to call them the active and the passive role. And the active is an activation of women programs to sort of allow for sort of financing of entrepreneurship, creating programs in rural areas where women cannot transport. Those are activation programs where we take people out of the labor force into it. Because one misleading indicator is not just looking at labor force participation or unemployment rates, but actually inactivity rates, which are very high. These are people.
What do you mean by that? What's the difference?
So the difference is inactivity rates are people that are not in the labor force. They're not employed nor actively looking for a job. Okay. So those are discouraged workers. Either discouraged because they've been looking and didn't find, or they're simply, mothers that are at home not working. And these are very high numbers. And then the last part, I think, is the passive. And there, I think, the social security is a problem. And we can talk about that later on in terms of sort of the benefits that women get.
You mean they don't get enough benefits, or the benefits for women
I actually think that there's a social security problem in general, where subsidies are mistargeted everywhere for women or not women. But sort of programs like pension systems, which allow for women to retire as early as 40 and 45, are actually counterproductive in many ways. So I think some of the reforms that have been done in the Arab world are very much misleading in the sense that they try to empower women, but actually are not really necessarily doing that by enlarging the segregation and trying to empower women as a sort of people that are helpless or sort of fragile is counterproductive in many ways. And I argue the UAE is actually a big example of the pension laws that require huge reforms both on the male and the female, but particularly on the female side, are very distortive. On the labor, I think because you've asked that side, on the reforms on the regulatory side, I think the labor laws are a huge problem, particularly on maternity leaves, for instance, as one example. The ILO's convention on maternity leave requires 14 weeks. The Gulf countries are exceptional with few African countries, which they have around 8 weeks, so even less than 12 weeks. So this is a huge problem. And on top of that, it's not only just a requirement of how many weeks, it's actually the fact that who funds the maternity leave. And by that, you have private sector funding the maternity leave. That is a disincentive for private sector to hire women if I know that there's a higher cost to me. Where in most governments around the world, you have the government sort of contributing towards that.
It's very interesting, and I think I really do have to stop at this point before we move on. I wanted to ask you, actually, because you work in finance, and you were saying how the participation rate of women in finance is quite low, and I think that that's perhaps true outside of the Middle East as well, and please correct me if I'm wrong. And it was mentioned that women end up in certain kinds of industries because they're seen as more women-friendly, more mother-friendly, more family-friendly. What do you think can be done to change the culture in the investment banking industry where you work?
I think, first of all, we have to look at this model of anywhere, anytime, that it means success.
You mean flexible working hours for women and mothers?
Exactly.
Okay.
So basically, the culture has to change bottom up and top down. So the culture starts at home. It is basically an initiative that has to be taken by the government and the social societies in any country to encourage women to go into high-power careers like finance and investment banking because they can improve their standard of living. And then from top down, from the CEOs and the decision makers in these institutions in the financial sector, to empower women and to encourage them to take higher positions. The problem that we have in Bahrain and other GCC countries, to be specific, that women are encouraged to take jobs that will not require them to be all the time on call or traveling.
You're saying that women are choosing that. They are choosing jobs where they know that they can try to have a balance.
And they're encouraged. Because
what do you mean encouraged?
If there is an opening in a bank for a position of an analyst or a portfolio manager or a treasurer, it won't go for a woman.
Because the women themselves won't apply?
Because it's a culture embedded in the organization itself. The women would apply, even internally they would apply. However, they will not be given a chance. And this is why we need actually to look at equal opportunities. We need to look from inside them, institutions themselves. However, we need the government to encourage that. There should be some incentives for organizations that would take these initiatives.
Yes, please go. I was just going to ask you, Kuwait has actually quite a high participation rate as well.
It does.
Why do you think, what's working there?
I think it's hard to put it down to a couple of things, but I think Kuwait, even though the whole Arab region occupies the lower end of, let's say, the gender gap index as a whole, but Kuwait is on the higher end of that category, and it's because of the history of just how we've been the whole generations ago, and I think that you cannot talk about women empowerment without looking at where the country stands. So if the country does not have equal rights and does not recognize human rights and does not recognize freedom of speech, then you're capped somewhere. So I think that Kuwait is a little bit superseding the rest of the Arab region just because we do have we enjoy some of these aspects more than the rest of the GCC in particular. But I'd like to allude to what Dr. Muna and Dr. Florencia have mentioned, counter-arguing here, is that I think we need to be very cautious about making women different in the workplace. I think we've seen how that can backfire. For instance, if I was working in the finance sector a long time ago actually, and when the law came out where it gave women the opportunity to have longer maternity leaves and it shortened everything else, well, an employer is somebody who wants to make money. So would he invest in me, or is he going to invest in my male? So that's something that we need to look at, and we shouldn't come up with haphazard laws and regulations that are just pro-women, because they're not pro-women when you're talking about the private sector, for instance. And I think
so you're saying that you're not in favor of legislating?
I'm not in
that
favor
area
of coming up with sort of flexi hours if they're not given to both.
To everybody.
To both. I think that the concentration.
So parental rights, for example, versus maternal rights.
I think that concentration on giving skills and meritocracy is more important today than distinguishing male and female.
Yes.
What about you, Florence? What do you think?
I think it's about productivity. I think that I agree broadly that it's best to have equal rights in the workplace. Meaning, when you rig rights in favor of women, you make the female laborer less attractive as an element in the workplace. So I agree with that broadly, but I also think it's about productivity, and I think the manner in which a society enhances the productivity of women is by encouraging them to think like entrepreneurs rather than as employees who have to clock hours from 9 to 5 and then go home. When women are encouraged to think like entrepreneurs, they become owners of their jobs, and they become more productive and therefore more valuable, equally, if not more valuable, than male members of the workplace, because women are extremely dedicated, extremely focused, and everybody knows that when a woman is motivated, she gets the job done. She doesn't drop the ball. I think we all know that. So, I'm a huge fan of promoting women who are serious and dedicated. And the way to do that is to offer women the opportunity to be entrepreneurs, either by encouraging them from a young age to think like entrepreneurs and to help them finance their companies, or within their workplace by encouraging them to be creative and entrepreneurial. That's very important.
I want to give you guys the chance to comment, because you raised the point about access to finance, and I wanted to ask you, with SICO, would you be more favorable towards a woman if she were seeking a loan? I know that that's not the business you're in exactly, but what is going to be done in order to improve access to finance for women entrepreneurs? And is that really, again, back to my question, is that really what's standing in the way in terms of women entrepreneurship? And I want you to also comment on that, because you work in order to give women the entrepreneurship skills, but clearly that's not the only thing. They need the skills and they need the money as well. So what's going to change? Is it going to change?
In Bahrain, we have created enterprises just to fund entrepreneurs in Bahrain, and surprisingly, the applicants were majority women. So we have the Family Bank, which is a bank that looks at microfinance. However, we have another organization, it's called Temkeen, which is empowerment. Temkeen has a special agenda whereby it does not only finance, but it consults, and it trains
so it provides
entrepreneurs.
Support,
so
advisory.
It provides the ongoing support. Now, the banks are looking at this aspect as well, funding SMEs, funding entrepreneurs, and actually we have very much successful stories in Bahrain. All we need is regulations to regulate.
Like what?
Actually, our central bank is looking at issuing new regulations just for financing entrepreneurs and looking at SMEs.
To encourage lending to small and
exactly.
Okay.
At the end of the day, we are talking about a huge segment of the market, even though the loan sizes or the finance size is small. However, we are looking at huge potential for banks.
Nice. So it makes sense for them. What you're saying is it makes financial sense for them to invest in women.
Like SICO, even though we are on the wholesale bank, on the wholesale banking side, however, even investment banks will benefit because eventually, when these businesses grow, we would take them public. We would look at private placement. Right. We will look at private equity investors to help them expand and grow their business.
Exactly. Yeah, so the skills, what is needed for a woman entrepreneur to go out there and get the loan she needs to start her business?
I think that just like you alluded in your questions, Carina, the Middle East has different realities. And when you look at the GCC, money is not really the issue. Today, Kuwait has a 2 billion KD fund that will fund any national project. So to the audience, if you
mean big infrastructure projects?
2 billion KD fund for small SMEs.
Okay.
Towards. So I'd encourage the audience, if you have any ideas, partner with a Kuwaiti. So the access to funding is there. However, the skill sets and getting them ready to apply for these funds is where we're lacking. So INJAZ is not the solution, but we go after teaching these skill sets to young youth, which is 21st century skills, very necessary, and that's not taught in schools.
So I just wanted to know, this is a good point, because a lot of times when you talk about entrepreneurship in general in the Middle East and women-specific entrepreneurship, it seems to me that we keep talking about a certain kind of entrepreneur, but is the financing, is the skill training reaching the disadvantaged people who don't even know that INJAZ exists in the first place? Are you reaching the lower segments of society? How are they going to even know that there is such a support available to them?
I can talk about INJAZ Kuwait, and we do, and I know my counterparts in Lebanon and Bahrain. We do. So we are functioning throughout the country in every sector. So we are reaching disadvantaged, the whole society, and we work specifically with government schools, which are, if you know the GCC, government schools rank a little bit less than any private school, so the education is not up to date. So today, what is prevalent is that we need to teach entrepreneurism, and I think by giving them these skills, at the least you'll create entrepreneurial thinking.
Yes. Can I just, on this point of how you favor women in the financing of entrepreneurial ventures, I think it's important to note here that we're not talking about creating institutions for women, because the minute you do that, it becomes a little bit of a knitting session. It's not, it means that women are not expected to be as competitive. It's about the mainstreaming of financing, such that I don't know how it's going to be achieved, but for example, the Scandinavians solved the problems of corporate governance, which were discriminatory against women a couple of generations ago, by imposing quotas for women on board.
Which they're doing here as well, or they're talking about it at least.
Here they're threatening to do it, and the threat of doing it has actually achieved a result. And that's
it's exactly what Lubna was saying earlier, is that she's not in favor of quotas, but if they do the job, then so be it.
Yeah.
So we need to set targets.
So something needs to be done. So a women's venture finance bank is not the answer. Training women is definitely the answer. Considering women within organizations and promoting them is the answer. And then passing policies that require that financial institutions have a minimum amount of lending or financing to women is important, because that is how women climb the curve.
Najla, you were about to make a point?
I just want to say that about women reaching positions of authority or being represented in boards of directors. We in Bahrain, for example, the initiative was taken by the government. In the Middle East, most of the public or the private sector companies that are listed in the various bourses are owned majority by the government. So the government of Bahrain took the initiative to appoint women in many boards. So today we have out of 23 companies, we have 32 seats taken by women. And these are on the back, majority on the back of the government taking the initiative to have their representatives as women with actually with merits, with a very relevant experience. But then someone has to take the initiative. You cannot just rely on the private sector, which is majority men, to look at women as basically the right choice.
Well, I think you raise a really good point, and I've been wanting to get back to this. You made a very good point about how a lot of times when we're crafting policy, and it was a response to my question about should we legislate this, that women are often seen as helpless victims with no control over their own destiny. And as you're saying that, someone needs to take the initiative. It's sort of, does it mean that women aren't taking the initiative enough? Should women be stepping up more? Do you feel that is reflective, that women are in fact being portrayed as the victims, whereas there are many women who are going ahead and grabbing the opportunities available to them?
I think there's definitely from the policy side this sort of victimizing of women, particularly in laws that allow women to only, be participants in particular jobs because of the fear that, long hours or what have you are, against women. So I think that the legal system is hampering sort of the movement, but I think there's a lot of women that are sort of progressing. I think I wanted to get back also to 2 points that happened before. One is on the legislative side of boards. So the UAE has just passed legislation that actually has to have on every government or corporate board a female represented. So that's one form of doing it. But on the entrepreneurship financing side, I think if you go outside the GCC, there is a fundamental problem, and that's the legal side again. You have to have a collateral when you're actually trying to borrow. Most of the time, women cannot inherit, cannot own a piece of land, so these things are hampering sort of women from also getting some financing. One of the other issues facing them is that they don't have networks, which men have for entrepreneurial networks, cannot have a women association in many cases form. These are things that also, I think, outside the sort of more developed parts of the region are big problems. And you look at the North Africans, Yemen, other places, I mean, these are highly, big problems are still found in these places. So I think it's, to a large extent, the legal side is a big barrier for many things, entrepreneurial or not. And then the last point that I wanted to make is the fact that women are still highly part of the informal sector. So they're
which
vulnerable.
Is also, yeah, and you said, you actually made the point that if we look at, we've been talking about the female participation rate in the labor force, you're saying that's not actually an accurate metric to be looking at. What should we be looking at to measure where women's status is today?
I think all of these numbers, how much are they in what's the percentage in informal sector? What is the participation rate? What's the inactivity rates? What's the unemployment? Unemployment among youth women is the highest in the world, 40 to 50% you're looking at. So you want to sort of segregate the parts of the economy, how much are in the agriculture sector, how much are not, how much of them are covered by the social security system, how are not. So it's different metrics that you're looking at here. And I think, we focus a lot on the labor market part, but I think we've done, because I think to a large extent we know that we've made strides in education and healthcare, meeting MDG 2 and MDG 3 in that sense. But I think we still have a fundamental problem even on the education side, where you have this U-shaped curve. Women on the uneducated still find jobs, and women highly educated find jobs. In the middle sort of leave the market. So the education returns are not there yet. So I think there's a lot to look at.
I wanted to add to Dr. Munir's point is that a phenomena in Kuwait, and I think also across the Arab world, is the invisible economy, where women have innovated and to attain their entrepreneurial desire, they've created projects and everything out of their house. I don't know if that is healthy for the economy, because it's in no way is it captured. However, it's a large phenomena.
Hi, my name is Sarah Al Husseini. Thank you first for your time today. My question is more general for all of the ladies on the panel today. I wanted to ask if you would be kind enough to share the one personality trait or characteristic that helped you through all the challenges that you would face as a career woman in the Middle East, or just a career woman in general. Thank you for your time.
Okay, great. So we have a question about
I think that today in Arab society we've seen reversal of changes, and we've seen an extreme albeit I think fairly localized reversal of changes in the phenomenon called ISIS. I don't know if you heard, but a couple of months ago, I at least saw in the press that the women of ISIS had issued a manifesto saying that women's rights and the liberation of women in Western societies was misleading and in fact a disservice to women. And that was issued by women who are members of ISIS. To me, that's the extreme of reversal. If this thing represents what it claims to represent. I don't know who issued that manifesto. I don't know how many women were behind it. Maybe it was 2.5 women or 2,500. I don't know. Maybe it was a bunch of men from ISIS. Who knows? But that is a good question. And I think, personally, the litmus test as to the reversibility of all of this in the Arab world today, if there were a litmus test anywhere, is probably Saudi Arabia. Because the advances that Saudi women made and were encouraged to make in the past 10 years in Saudi Arabia. I grew up in Saudi Arabia. I spent 16 years there. I never thought, growing up there, that one day I'd be able to travel back as a professional woman and check into the Four Seasons Hotel on my own, you know, without anyone signing for me at the airport. So all of that changed very, very rapidly in Saudi Arabia between 2004 and 2014. A lot changed. And the question today is any of this easily reversible? And I would tend to believe, obviously there are the localized examples, such as what I referred to. However, I would tend to believe because of advances in information technology, social networking and Facebook and all of that, it's going to be hard to reverse all of that. Even, for example, the one deputy minister in Saudi Arabia who was a woman was removed a couple of weeks ago. Even if that were to happen, and we try to call that a reversal of sorts, you still have masses and masses of women in Saudi Arabia who are communicating on Twitter, starting their own businesses at home, communicating with men, all of that. And I think that's going to be very hard to reverse. And that is the essence of things. It's not about how many women are ministers. It's about what proportions of the masses are leading a life that is culturally different from the generation of their mothers. And I think there's a lot of that happening.
What about constitutional rights?
I think it was James that asked this question. So, one, I think that there's definitely advancements on that front. So, on most of the examples that I've given, actually, most Arab countries have actually liberalized, where women now can get their own passports, can travel with few adjustments here and there. I don't think there's a reversal. I think there's going forward. You have many countries now signing the UN Convention for Elimination of All Discrimination Against Women, with no exceptions. So the UAE, for instance, have it as is. So these are definitely advancements that you're finding more and more. So I think we're moving towards eliminating these constitutional differences, with the exception of few countries. Again, Yemen is one of those that is more sticky on that front.
And you want to address that as well?
I also think it's a very important question, and I would say that we need to differentiate what have we achieved here. So, have we really achieved something that is world renowned? I don't think so. There's so much to be attained for the region, and I think that you can look at the GCC, and obviously for the GCC to look a little bit attractive, they're throwing a woman here, a woman there. So not everything that we're seeing is true change. So we need to take that into consideration. However, there are grassroots things. There are grassroots changes, and I agree with all the panel that these things will not go away. And if any of you are close to looking at the new generation, I think they're even crazier than we were. So I don't think that they're going to agree on anything going backwards. I think that today the new generation is more angry, more feel they want to get out more from their countries. Else, if that doesn't happen, then as we also see, there's a flight of talent. So if you can't take it, there's a flight of talent.
Would you guys like to share the personal traits that you feel have been most useful to you and have stood you in good stead in your career so far?
I would say perseverance.
Najla?
Hard work.
I think hard work everywhere, but faith. I think you have to believe in what you're doing. If you believe it's important, you keep at it.
Yeah, I think it's definitely hard work, and I think it's often I'm asked this question, I always answer that, I never identified myself with my gender, so it was never an issue for me that I'm a female. I never thought that any opportunity that a man can have, I can.
I just wanted to raise a question, actually, and it's more, none of you have addressed the challenges because, as you may know, the Middle East needs to create at least, the whole MENA region needs to create at least 50 million jobs in the next decade. And at least 50 women participation is required for that. What are the challenges that you think that women will face and, what government can do?
Hi, so you are all leaders, and that means that you have to be very good with working with people, both men and women. And I think sometimes, at least I find, working with a group of only women is very easy, and working with a group of only men is easy. But when you're working with a group of both men and women, it could be very difficult because you have to be sensitive to the needs of both men and women. And I think this applies to men as well. So you're obviously very good with working with other people. So what are your tips on, how to balance the needs of both genders or culture as well?
I don't want to sort of delve into my family history, but my grandmother was a single my grandmother was a single mother in Baghdad in the 1950s. And the only reason why she was able to divorce my grandfather was because she was financially secure. She was the headmistress of a school. I feel like the current debates often with women empowerment concentrate on how good it is for the economy. Do you feel like little is said on how much freedom and leverage it gives women in marriages?
Yeah, the first, I think what you were alluding to is something that not only the government needs to take care of, but it needs to be a collaborative effort between government, private sector, and NGO. Today, INJAZ exists because of these issues, and it is a very important issue where we don't know what tomorrow is going to hold because of this huge bulge of youth that are today unemployed.
So do you think the jobs should be, the massive jobs that need to be created, should there be a quota of jobs that are targeted at women specifically? Is that going to solve the problem?
I can talk about Kuwait as an example. Today, the government employs close to 85% of the population, and this is hidden unemployment. So what it's created is that you come in, you have a salary, nobody can actually kick you out, but I don't know if that's an advantage or not. I think that creates another sort of issue.
Bahrain is very active on that front.
I don't believe that we should create jobs for women. We simply create jobs, and women can take any job. The issue here, the challenges that women face is basically at the entry level, that women are their worst enemies. They look at jobs that would give them the flexibility of juggling between family and work. It shouldn't be the case because I think there are compromises in life, and if you compromise on some of the family time, it is for a good reason, and at the end of the day, this guilt feeling that women tends to carry should just go away. Because
how did you get over it? You have 3 children?
I have 3 children, but then I truly believe that I'm doing very well. I'm showing them that I can be successful as much as their father, and I'm giving them the best role model they could ever have. At the end of the day, I'm securing them a very good living, and without both, in these days in the Arab world, without both parents working, it is very tough. It is very difficult.
It is indeed. Florence, I just wonder if you wanted to also, make a comment, but do you want to make a comment as well about outside of the GCC, countries like Egypt and Jordan who are resource poor but have just as much a youth population and an unemployment problem as well?
Curiously, they have the same problems. Even, in Lebanon, if you look very closely, Lebanon is a country where women dance on tables and, walk around in bikinis with their hookah, argile, and all of that. But are there a sufficient number of women in the private sector at senior levels of the private sector and in the entrepreneurial space? No, there aren't. So the problems are there throughout the region, and it is because of cultural barriers that the region has yet to shed.
So you're saying that despite the progressiveness on the cultural side for women, it hasn't actually translated into more empowerment on the economic front?
Not at all.
It's not just a cultural barrier. Mona?
I think there's several questions, but on the 50 million jobs, I think I agree with Najla that there's a need to create jobs simply. It's an economic problem more than anything, but also on the education side, you need to be able to have women go into degrees that actually are needed also. You're not to stick to their comfort zone in humanities and what have you. If the market is needing more things required to STEM or engineering or what have you, you need to major also in these things. So it's a bucket of both. And then on Basim's question on freedom of marriage or divorce or what have you, again, it brings you back to my main point on if you cannot inherit, if you cannot divorce, if you cannot marry based on your own choices, it makes it very hard for women to feel secure. And if they always need to go back to the informal sort of institutions, which is the family, that's also very restricting on going forward. And the problem with that is that women can enter entrepreneurial, so there's a high number of women entrepreneurs on the nascent sort of, but they cannot actually scale up because families are unable to scale up with you. If I don't have my financial independence, if I need to go back to my husband, if I have to have sign a document for me to borrow money, these are all restrictive issues.
Just one word answer from everybody. What one thing that needs to change in the near term?
I think I listed 1,000 ones.
Put you on the spot.
I mean, I think legal reform, I think it comes first to mind here.
Florence?
I think the financing of entrepreneurship for women.
More policies to support women without quotas. We don't want discrimination. However, we need policies to encourage empowerment of women.
Education.
Thank you so much, everybody.